thank everyone for having me for the invitation. I've never been to Barnard Hall for the first time since the renaming, and it's like coming home. I grew up in Oxford, Mississippi, and there's a Barnard Hall, which is a physics building. In fact, a lot of Barnard observatories and Barnard Halls, because Frederick A.P. Barnard was a major 19th century scientist and physicist, and he was president of Columbia University, which is where Barnard College comes from. He became very interested in teaching mining and the physics and geology behind mining. So a lot of the faculty that founded Montana College, Montana State, learned under Barnard. And I was going to go deep into that with you. And while I was looking at that, I realized that this isn't named after that Barnard. It's named after a local Barnard. Yeah. So, but anyway, maybe in 100 years from now, we'll forget that part. And it'll be Barnard Hall, as it should be as a physics building. Yeah, so I work primarily on 19th century physics, 19th century exploration. I used to work a lot on the oceans. I kind of changed into the mountains, partly because I became interested in a physicist, John Tyndall, Irish physicist, and he is known for his experimental verification of the natural greenhouse effect, but it turns out he did that in his lab at the Royal Institution using an instrument he made, a electrophoto, what is it called? I can't remember the name of the instrument. And that's how he's known for this. Photo ratio spectrometer. That's it. But actually the way he had originally done it is by climbing mountains and taking measurements at the bottom of mountains and then at the top of mountains. And he was a major mountaineer in the Victorian era, one of the golden age climbers. And so I became interested in that relationship between climbing and advances in science. So there are certain questions in science that can only be answered if you view things vertically and can actually reach into that vertical realm to do your research. I think Tyndall's a good example. I want to move past, Forbes and Tyndall and the physicists that I study and talk about some of the new work I've been doing. This is rough as far as the rough cut, and I'm going to talk about Charles Darwin and Darwin's work in South America. Just a little timeline. Darwin traveled to South America. He graduated from Cambridge in 31 and then joined the Voyage of the Beagle for 5 years until 1836. And when he came back, he was not yet an evolutionist. He was convinced that the Christian story was wrong. He had gathered a lot of material. Most people focus specifically on his time in islands, and especially the Galapagos. And then sometime in 37, let's say May of 1837, so he's been back about half a year, about a year, or almost a year, he hits on the idea of transmutation, of natural selection. And then that radically changes a year later in 1838 when he reads Malthus and has a Malthusian moment. And so from 38 till 59, so about 20 years, he works on that theory and publishes it. So if I can get this working. So it's your regular kind of view of evolutionary theory. Of course, it's completely wrong. It's unidirectional. It's progressive. It's racist from black to white. And then this is our usual sort of take on it, is the role of islands, and especially island biogeography, and especially island biogeography then extended to continent and continent biogeography. And then that's where Darwin sort of starts and ends the origin. But I want to look at a different tack with his work in the And I guess the overall theme is how our spaces, which are kind of devoid of meaning, how are they turned into actual places that have meaning and significance, and specifically how sort of spaces are turned into scientific places. So how you turn geographies into laboratories. This has a long history. Of course, Tyndall did this with his climate change research. Forbes did this with glaciology. There's a lot of different scientists in the 19th century that turned physical geographies, especially mountains, into laboratories. Darwin, I found, kind of did a step more. Instead of using the mountain as a laboratory, or thinking about mountains or thinking on mountains, Darwin thought through them or with them. He used mountains as his analytical tool, which is sort of an extra step up. And once you catch that in Darwin's work, and you go back through his unpublished diaries and his notebooks and all his letters, all of which are searchable online today, you can see how important mountain and mountain ranges were. In fact, I would argue that mountains and mountain geography and mountain geology was the most important physical geology for his research, far eclipsing islands or any other type of geography. So in 1834, Darwin had his first mountain named after him. This is Mount Darwin and Tierra del Fuego. In fact, the entire range is named after Darwin. It's the Darwin Range. It's the southern part of the Andes. It's as long as the entire Alps. This is a huge mountain range, a huge mountain, very imposing. At this point, Darwin was unknown to anyone except Fitzroy on the Beagle and a couple professors that he had at Cambridge. So he's not known for mountains or mountaineering, but this is the first connection that's going to happen. And so why does Fitzroy name a mountain after Darwin? Why are there glaciers and mountains throughout the world and mountain ranges named after him? It turns out Darwin stuck to a pretty specific pattern when he was on the Beagle. They would go to port somewhere, he would jump off, and he would hightail it to the highest mountains that he could find, always trying to summit to the top. Sometimes he would hire a guide or horses. If they weren't available, he would go alone, sometimes with his shooter, and always to the highest regions. So it's interesting that he was doing this before mountaineering is even a sport. So we usually think about mountaineering as a sport rising in the 1850s, and then coming to sort of the golden age in the 60s and 70s. So this is early 30s. So he's participating or practicing in alpinism before alpinism even exists. There's reasons why he's doing this. His hero was Alexander von Humboldt. Humboldt was a Prussian mining engineer who also had traveled through South America at the turn of the century in the 1800s, 1800 to 1805, and attempted to climb Chimborazo, which is in the background, which is then thought to be the highest mountain in the world. And he comes out of that experience. He had reached the altitude record, and he writes a book. His first publication is called An Essay on the Geography of Plants, and it explains how altitude relates to different kind of plants, and that's also related to then higher latitudes as you change from the equator to the poles. So they call this the correspondence between altitude and latitude, the correspondence principle. It basically ran all of biogeography throughout the 19th century. I won't get into it, but Wallace is the one that figures out that that's not right, and that's why Wallace's line and between Bali and Lombok is so important, because you realize how incorrect this is. But it led all of Darwin's thinking and other geographers and botanists at the time. It's another famous Humboldtian print, which shows Chimborazo cut out and then linking all the plants. You can also see on the writing on the left and right are other mountain ranges throughout the globe. Darwin specifically went on the voyage to follow in Humboldt's footsteps. He specifically went to South America because Humboldt had gone there. Humboldt had climbed in Tenerife, And Darwin was especially interested in climbing the Pic de Tenerife. Wrote all about it. All his letters leading up to the voyage of the Beagle are all about Tenerife, and he can't wait to climb the peak there. And the Beagle gets there, and there's been a cholera outbreak. And so the Beagle is quarantined for 19 days and then has to leave. So he never gets to climb there. And you can see in his diaries and journals how important it was. And he starts looking for other peaks and other places to climb. His first major climbs are when he gets to South America. This is a regular kind of quote you get from his journals and his diaries to show how interested he is in mountaineering, but also how he feels it's the flavor of the day and how much it can help him with his own sort of manliness and adventure, but also his science as he moves forward. One of the first places he also goes is to what's the place with the big Christ?
Rio.
In Rio, yeah. So he goes to Rio and he climbs that. And of course, no one had been there too much. It's not like it is today. And he goes at length into how mountains can help you do your science, how clear the atmosphere is, how the vegetation drastically changes, and you can see it. How immersing yourself in the field can be valuable. And again, this is prior to when field work is really acknowledged as authoritative in the way that it's going to be later in the century. He was also, again, interested in islands, but he's interested in islands primarily because they have mountains. And in fact, he's interested in tropical islands because they have Arctic plants on the top of them. So he's sending back all his material, and he's noting on each plant that he's getting where it's found elevation-wise, and then asking the botanists back in England if they're Arctic. Is this one Arctic? Is it similar to what you would find, in Antarctica or in those regions? Darwin spent most of his time in this area, especially in the lower part that's cut off in Tierra del Fuego. And it's in Tierra del Fuego that he has these major epiphanies about mountains. So if you've ever been to that area, it's just a bunch of islands. And it's island after island after island. And the Beagle is cruising through all of these surveying. That's the reason why they're there. So on the 5-year voyage, they spent about 3.5 years in that area just surveying it. And Darwin writes in his notebook, he says, I wonder what the Andes look like if they don't look like this. And it's kind of the first time you realize that he's equating what he's seeing in Tierra del Fuego with these islands as, and he's going to say this in The Origin of Species, that mountains are just islands on land, or islands are just mountains in the ocean. So it's his first connection where he's starting to get to that. This is actually Darwin's, this is from one of Darwin's publications. He's spending most of his time down here. He's climbed and done some stuff over here. And now he's going to go to this mid-section in Chile. And he's going to make 3 inland tours into across the Andes from Santiago to Mendoza, right? And so this takes you over the Portillo Pass, which is a relatively high pass, about 16,000 feet, and that's going to come back via the Upsallata Pass. And this is the most dramatic experience Darwin has on his voyage of the Beagle. This is the Upsallata Pass. This is modern day. They have a ski hill there now. But you can see this is rather rugged terrain. So when he's going over the first evening, going over Portillo Pass, the higher one, a fog rolls in below him, and he sees the mountain peaks out of the fog, and then makes the connection of some of the geological forces at work. That is, that mountains exist in the ocean. If you drain the ocean, you would have similar mountains and Tierra del Fuego that he's standing on. Up here, he's collecting all the shells that he finds. He's particularly interested in the shells on each side of the pass. It seems on the Patagonia side, the shells don't change very much. In fact, they retain their color. Whereas on the Pacific side, the Chilean side, the fossils change much more drastically, especially the fossil shells. And so this is a slide of it. He says, yeah, this can be explained then by the differing of sinking of the Atlantic and the Pacific. So if you read his autobiography, which is written much later in life, and historians don't value that sort of thing as much as the actual letters. But he has this weird statement where he says, yeah, I came up with my coral reef theory in the middle of the Andes. And so when Darwin came back, the first thing he publishes is a paper I'll talk about volcanic action and earthquakes. But his major book is on coral reefs, and he comes up with the correct theory of coral reef formation. He does it from seeing these different shells on each side of the pass in Portillo, and realizes that you have differing types of uplift on each side. And so the Chilean side is being uplifted more gradually. The Patagonian side was much younger, which would have been radical at that time. And then you have an equally different sort of subsistence in the ocean, and those things are always linked. So you can start seeing how mountain formations and mountains start creating all of the geography of the entire system. Not only how mountains are formed and maybe what kind of shells you have, but then also what's happening in the Pacific Ocean and how coral reefs are formed. So he comes up with his coral reef formation while in the Andes. This is a letter he writes to his sister right after coming out of the Upsallata Pass. He says, I can't express to you the delight I felt winding up all of my geology in South America. I literally could hardly sleep at night for thinking over my day's work. Scenery was so majestic as everything at 12,000 feet is. This last trip has added a half a mule's load. Well, plenty of proof. I do not expect a word I've written to be believed. So this way predates evolutionary theory and Darwin's thinking. So what is this proof he needs? What did he see? Darwin has his most dramatic moment of his 5-year voyage on Upsallata Pass. He stumbles upon a petrified forest. There's actually 70 trees that are still standing. There's probably 120 trees overall, and they're huge chunks, and some of them rise kind of 7 feet high. And he contemplates then the geology behind what's happening. He's training himself in geology. He's got volume 1, and now by now volume 2 of Lyell's Principles of Geology. Volume 2 is all about mountain formations and the theories of Eli de Beaumont and von Buch. And so is it heat or is it water that's forming this? What is the relationship between volcanoes and earthquakes? These are the sorts of questions he's asking, and he stumbles on this petrified forest, and everything changes for him. He tells this story and he creates this narrative in his mind, and he says, look, this was a forest that was by the ocean, probably some lush, maybe even a tropical island, a lush island, that has then sunk probably 7,000 to 9,000 feet into the bottom of the ocean, where volcanic activity then has occurred, covered them up, and the whole thing has been risen up again to about 7,500 feet, all within relatively recent geological time periods where you can still have shells with the same color nearby. And so this is a dramatic sort of story. It's well beyond sort of the Lyellian uniformitarian sort of framework that he would have come there with. But geology is complicated. a lot of this is complicated. So what's so amazing is that he not only sees this process in his imagination, in his mind, but can work out all the mechanisms that are associated with it, and then place that three-dimensional rising and falling through a fourth dimension of time to create this entire system of continent building and ocean subsistence based on the swelling of the planet that he sees from just this petrified forest. What's amazing as a historian is you can go through all his notebooks and his journals and his diary, which he created from those notebooks and journals, and you can see that at this time, in the middle of 1835, all his writing completely changes. He's very conservative before he sees this. He's asking sort of similar Humboldtian, Lyellian questions about what he's looking at. After he finds this petrified forest, after he spends 19 days in the mountains, there's no hypothesis that's too radical. His questions become extremely radical. His imagination has mountains being sort of born and fallen in relative time, rather recent time. And then, and only then, does he start asking different questions about species. He was interested in the shells and how they differ, but only because he was interested in coral reefs. He had spent a year and a half on a boat where all he was doing was soundings and helping these sorts of things. All he cared about was where coral reefs are. It was a major question. After the mountains, he starts viewing mountains as barriers and starts asking questions about how those barriers might work. Darwin takes this volume into account, the third and fourth dimension, offering a complex sort of visual way of seeing the past and seeing mountains form. So I think we can, this is in the publication of The Voyage of the Beagle, where he describes this sort of the subterranean forces at work. We don't need to go into that. But this is his publication then of the Upsiata and Portillo passes. It's the first geological cross-section of the Andes ever published. When Darwin comes back from The Voyage of the Beagle, and by the time he publishes this in 39, he is arguably the greatest geologist that's alive. He's published on coral reefs as the correct coral reef formation. He's now published A Voyage of the Beagle, which is primarily about geology. There's nothing about species in it. And then he comes out with his geological researches and then his Geology of South America, which are his two major texts that appear in 39 and 1846. He knows more about South American geology and more about mountain formation and the forces of mountain formation than anyone alive. This is his first paper. Well, I should say this: Darwin is sending material back in letters to Henslow, who was his professor at Cambridge. And Henslow, unbeknownst to Darwin, although it's sort of standard practice, Darwin acts surprises, but I think he wasn't. Henslow is sending those to the Cambridge Philosophical Society, which is then publishing them. So Darwin first publications happens when he's on the Beagle, and they're all about his Portillo and Upsiata observations. The first sort of petrified forest observations and what he thinks about it are given in those publications. So people know Darwin for the first time. If you weren't his buddy at Cambridge or went hunting with him, then you know him as a geologist, as a mountain geologist. When he comes back, this is the first paper he writes. It's called On the Connection of Certain Volcanic Phenomena in South America and on the Formation of Mountain Chains and Volcanoes and the Effects of the Power of which Continents are Elevated. You can just break down the title and you can figure out what it's about. What he figures out is in an area of about 1,200 miles that the whole molten the molten core, which is only about less than 20 miles deep for Darwin, which would have been another dramatic change from how you viewed things geologically, according to Lyell and others. That whole thing is rising up, and it's creating at the same time earthquakes and volcanic phenomena, and it's raising mountains. The main publication then is Geological Observations. And you can see again the subtitle is Volcanic Islands in Parts of South America that he voyaged on in the Voyage of the Beagle. This is the tour de force in mountain creation. It's actually told through the vertical. So you start on the beach, and then you move inland and upward. So you take the reader not only upward as you do this, but also backward. You begin with the most recent of times and the recent strata, and then you work back. His term is ascending to the oldest strata and deep time, when the mountains and the Andes were mere islands like Tierra del Fuego. So the entire narrative is not only about mountain creation, but it's told through a verticality or a vertical narrative. He allows you to travel with him as he goes through the step-like gravel capped plains, as he rides through the Pampas at about 3,500 feet, to the flanks of the Cordillera at 7,000 feet, over the Portillo and up the Alta passes, where then he includes the geological cross-section. That's the climax of this narrative, until he's at the spine of the continent at 14,000 feet. Then he describes the neighboring peaks and then shows in the background Aconcagua at 23,000 feet. So he starts at sea level, he climaxes with the Portillo and Alta passes, and then even goes further to describe this other geology. So you can see here then, and this is kind of what I mean by it, he scribbled in this weird scribble on his notebook that the Andes created all of South America. And there's nothing else around that scribble that suggests he's thinking that. It might have been written later. It's written in a notebook in 1834. But you can see what mountains, how they function in his thought. That they are all encompassing. They give you not only a narrative of the entire geological system, but then they describe everything else, including volcanoes, earthquakes, fossils, biogeography, and everything else. This is kind of what I mean by not, as Humboldt would have done, sort of made measurements and do your science on mountains, but you're thinking through mountains and through the vertical realm. We can change very quickly to a narrative about species, because most people are interested in his species questions. So, again, Darwin supposedly, historians, and you can see this in his notebooks pretty well, historians place sort of his first thoughts about transmutation and evolution through some sort of selection mechanism. Is happening in May of 1837. But already in his notebooks, he's starting to transform his thinking of mountains. So you see him talk about, do the Andes until he separates geographical range of plants. As Patagonia has risen from the waters in so late a period, it may be interesting to consider whence came its organized beings. So this is time when you're asking questions of, is it one center of creation or two? The two or multiple centers. The multiple centers are the sort of creationist people, and then the one centers are these sort of radical thinkers about that perhaps transmutation is occurring. And all this work's going to start putting Darwin into the one center of creation, where then you have to travel, and barriers become extremely important. Great contrast to the two sides of the Cordillera, where climate is similar. Go steadily through all the limits of birds and animals in South America. It's where the climate is similar part that's interesting to me. Again, everyone is Humboldt. Everyone is thinking through the correspondence principle. You shouldn't have similar altitude or similar climates and not have similar species, right? There are these dramatic zones of both north-south and up-down that guide biogeography, and Darwin because he's passed over the sides, is transforming that. And then here's really where you get to where mountains become exceedingly important. So the motion of the earth must be excessive up and down. This is when he's starting to think about all that, right? The Andes mark the line between sinking and rising. This is how the Andes are creating all of South America. And then this is early on in his notebook B. Notebook B was started because he starts thinking about, it's his species notebook. Elevation and subsistence are continually forming species, right? When Darwin writes this, he's working on his geological observations on South America, which is going to come out in 39. He's working on his Voyage of the Beagle, which is all about this. He's published his first papers all about volcanic action and the rising of the molten forces beneath us. And it's exactly when he then comes to his first theories of species change. So what's important for Darwin is not that the regular story where he gets these birds back from a zoologist, Gould, who shows Darwin, and Darwin didn't even know this, that the finches that he had collected are actually different species and they're found on different islands. That's always kind of the standard narrative where, yes, it's the Galapagos work, and once that Galapagos work was interpreted, that Darwin comes up with this theory. Once you realize that all he's doing is climbing mountains, that he's interested in mountains, and that they form sort of the analytical tool to understanding complex systems and cause and effect relations, and you go back and read his notebooks, you realize that it's not the finches or tortoises at all. It was as he was working on his most important mountain formation papers that his first inklings of evolutionary theory, especially through natural selection, occurred in his notebooks. So that's Darwin. The argument for the rising of mountain ranges looks very similar to his later argument on the origin of species. You have one overarching force that then explains a multitude of different effects. Darwin, in the origin of species, is going to refer back to William Whewell and what's called consilience of induction, where you take sort of all these disconnected facts that are all explained by one theory. And the origin of species, of course, it's evolution through natural selection. The argument in his mountain text, coral reef texts, all of them, are exactly the same, and even the language is the same. What Darwin has done is gone back to his notebooks, gone back to his publications, taken out the really good arguments and how they're worded, rewording them with species and species change, and then publishing them as on the origin of species. The other thing, so it gives him a model for how to argue and put together those arguments, and it actually gives them the words and phrases. The other thing that and I'll kind of end with this, that people might not realize is the origin of species, it sets up the theoretical argument in the first 4 chapters, and then you have 9 chapters of examples of sort of this consilience of induction, whether it's rudimentary organisms or the fossil record or morphology or embryology. But the only subject that gets 2 chapters is biogeography. It was the only topic that he thought demanded more than 1 chapter. Of those 2 chapters, one is entirely about oceans, and that's where you get Galapagos Islands and things like that. And the other is entirely about mountains and mountain biogeography. A lot of that comes from his thinking in South America, but a lot of it comes from this dude, a guy named Joseph Dalton Hooker. Hooker was a famous botanist. He was the son of the director of Kew Gardens. He would become the next director of Kew Gardens. And it's who Darwin chose to first tell his theory. I don't know if you can see it. It's in the middle of the page. But Darwin says, I am almost convinced, quite against the opinion I started with, that species or not is like confessing a murder. immutable. Right? So this is the first time Darwin ever tells anyone that he's starting to think that species aren't immutable. It's like confessing a murder. It's actually a very powerful, powerful statement. Hooker had gone on the voyage of the Erebus and Terror with Captain Ross, and it's a famous voyage to Antarctica. He had probably attained the furthest south of any naturalist. He comes back, he's looking for another place to go. As a traveling naturalist, he gets this article or this letter from Darwin, and he immediately plans a trip to the Himalaya. So he's the first one. It's a state-sponsored British trip to Kanchenjunga, and then Byron's at Kanchenjunga. And he's there specifically to look at plants on mountain ranges for Darwin. So the next one. So this is like the kind of letter Hooker would write to Darwin. Notice it's a year before the publication of Origin of Species. You put a string on the globe on England and another on Van Diemen's Land, and we'll run through the most continuous masses of land on the globe, the greatest stretch of all but dry land that you can find. I can connect the botany the whole way by mountains, right? Borneo, Java, Kazai, Himalaya, Caucasus, Alps, Scandinavia. I can thus connect botanically England with Tasmania better than I could Canada with Fuegia. This is important again because of this sort of one center of creation or multiple. This shows that it's one center. You can populate the entire globe with the same plant. And interestingly enough, what happens with Ice Age theory and everything else is the plants disappear in the interbreeding lowlands. So you have the same plants on the top of all these mountains that you can connect through time. And here's Charles Darwin on the Origin of Species. The Himalaya, on the mountain ranges of India, on Ceylon, on the volcanic cones of Jana, many plants occur either identically the same or representing each other at the same time, representing plants of Europe, not found in the intermittent hot lowlands. There's a lot of sections from Hooker's letters that sort of get plagiarized almost exactly in Darwin's On the Origin of Species. That's an anachronistic term. They often use each other's material without telling anyone. So here you can see then that not only is Darwin coming up with grand schemes of mountains and thinking through mountains, and this is sort of my concluding part. Not only is his imagination roused by that physical process and being physically there, not only does he become much less conservative and dramatic in his thinking, but it's his first inkling that leads him to evolutionary theory. It's actually an incorrect theory, his first theory. It gets transformed with Malthus, and then all of this other stuff kind of drops out. But it's still the initial instigator of his thoughts. And then it's all his buddies collecting for him and sending them back that then incorporates, I think, the most two persuasive chapters in On the Origin of Species. One quick other note is Darwin had completely misread the geology of the Petrified Forest. It's not right at all. It turns out it didn't sink into the bottom of the ocean and get covered, and it didn't dramatically rise. All right, he had messed up a little bit because of the Andes and borders to not quite understand what Wallace is going to talk about of zones of vegetation that are next to each other that are very different. So in that sense, mountains are going to mislead him there as well. It's not the first time in the history of science where you misread data that leads you to the correct theory. Darwin's full of that. And that's also a story of Darwin and Mountains as well. So again, just final sentence. I guess the theme is how does it work? How are spaces turned into scientific places? And I think with Darwin, you have not only a specific mountain, but mountains in general that become general sites for theorizing. That you can think with and through and not just on or about, and they become extremely important for the next 25 years in the sciences. people like Hooker and Tyndall and Whymper and others are going to go to the mountains specifically to do science. And you kind of wonder if, although we have forgotten it, they knew the connection that the greatest scientist of the time, by the name Charles Darwin, had set that example as a mountaineer before. So I think I'll end there. I have no idea how interesting that is or not. It's a weird feeling. Right? I know I'm interested in it.
Very interesting.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for.
Well, yes, doubly that. So you give the impression that you've read a vast amount of that. I'm sure that's true. And you give the impression that in these diaries, you could see what he thought about today and the next day and the next day. Do you see changes from day to day as ideas develop?
Yeah, I mean, that's the beauty of Darwin, is he wrote so much. I mean, he was averaging about 35 letters a day in the 50s, right? And it's all published and it's all word searchable online. He wrote not only field notebooks and field diaries, but then recopied them in expanded form into notebooks and his diary. His diary is 800 pages long, all available, word searchable online. All his notebooks, everything is available online. And then every edition of all his works are online. So the Voyage of the Beagle goes through like 19 editions, and every one of those changes, especially after he's willing to admit transmutation. So you can see the changes in his thinking. I wouldn't say day to day, but certainly month to month and year to year. I would say the one part where you do see it with change, dramatic change, is when he is in the mountains in the middle of the Andes. And you don't see that. And then in 37, his notebooks transform when he comes up with evolution. You can see that as well. So those are the two that really pop out. But it's wonderful. I mean, every single thing Darwin ever thought or wrote or did is now online and word searchable. Yeah.
How does climate change or the theory of climate change sort of come into all the thinking? I mean, it's Agassiz going on at about the same time. And, did Darwin recognize that those stumps were from a different climate period?
Yeah, no, so unfortunately, Darwin didn't figure out the Ice Age, what was called the Glacier Theory. It's happening at the exact same time. Forbes is sort of traveling and living with Agassiz on the, but that's all happening, and Darwin's kind of alone in South America with this crazy Christian Fitzroy. So he's removed from that, and he reads everything without it. He comes back and writes a paper about the parallel roads of Glenroy, using this exact theory that he's created with. But by then, glacier theory is taking hold. The Ice Age has come up, and he's roundly criticized because he completely messes up.
Parallel theories of
the parallel roads of Glenroy. There's an area in the highlands where it's dramatic glacial evidence for the existence of glaciers, and Darwin thought that was his mechanisms of rising and falling of the land. So he completely gets it wrong, and then everyone criticizes him, and that's when he transforms his thinking. So by the time you get to the origin of species, you do have glacial theory that's accepted. He does understand that it's only through dramatic vicissitudes in temperature that you can have speciation in the way that he wants it to. You get a fully sort of climactic change theories in the origin, but not when he's doing his mountain stuff. And of course, it's more in line with Tyndall and these sorts of things. It's not, the climate change wasn't bad. They weren't thinking of it as killing species or these sorts of things. They're still thinking of it in sort of Huttonian cyclical ways. And many, even Tyndall, have actually made the planet habitable, and so in the end is a good, sort of a good thing. Yeah.
So how did the Finch's story come to be the more
popular narrative.
Yeah, I probably downplayed it a little too much. It certainly did influence Darwin. He came when Gould tells him about the finches. He had already been thinking about this, and that's when he realized that that islands could be the way to really explain this, and that it can be used as an analogy that continents are island. And his notebooks after that turn all to like, what kind of megafauna do you have in Australia versus Africa versus North America? And he's writing everyone, including Isles of Grey in the United States, about all of the flora and fauna on our continent and in the mountains, et cetera. So it is important. It becomes especially important in the narrative because Darwin focuses on it so much and on the origin of species. And then Alfred Russel Wallace and other people who are co-discoverers of natural selection. Wallace is an island biogeographer and wrote a book called Island Life in 2 volumes that sort of is one of the best arguments for evolutionary theory. So I think that's how what I don't understand is why the diary, which is 800 pages and becomes the Voyage of the Beagle, he cuts it in half, basically. So he gets rid of all the stuff he doesn't want, and that's all of his mountaineering. Right? And I'm not sure that it might have to do with not wanting to come across as sort of a manly adventurer, but focus on the science or something like that. But that's what gets cut.
So the voyage is parallel to his diaries, except that he removed that.
Yeah, and he removed other things as well. It loses the day-to-dayness of it and becomes sort of periods of time. It's a great read, but his diary is an even better read. Yeah.
So I just kept thinking about how he was plagued by stomach problems for his whole life. That happened after he got back, or?
No, so that's why this whole gotten bitten by the bug thing comes about, because he gets sort of deathly ill right after being in the Andes. And so the whole theory that he got Chagas's disease and stuff, you can see that in his journals. You know, he has sort of pneumonia symptoms for about a month. And so once he gets back to Chile and back to the coast, he kind of lays in bed for a month. And you can see that in his letters and diaries and things. It actually gives credence a little bit to that theory until you start seeing it later on. And then it does seem to be a lot more psychosomatic, especially once he gets closer to telling everyone and then waiting for the origin to come out and then having to defend it. And then he's a complete mess. And the symptoms are different than Chagas's disease. So I always tend to think of him that it was extremely psychosomatic. The other thing that gets missed on that is all the Victorian scientists were like that. Like Tyndall, he couldn't breathe and needs to take, and he ends up kind of a drug alcohol addict because he's taking all this stuff for stomach pains. Every major Victorian scientist at the time had stomach pains, and a lot of them took ether to help with that.
But he wasn't climbing these big peaks with these pains.
No, he gets very sick. He's kind of sick for the rest of the voyage at times, but he's also always been very seasick, so they get messed up. And then when he comes back, he's much better. And he goes to the highlands, the last time he really climbs it all. And then, again, it's kind of right when in 37, when he comes up with evolution, that he starts getting all these stomach illness. And then he never travels again. Right? He basically never leaves his at down. So when he buys a house, gets married, and has 12 kids or however many.
Oh, great. Thank you so
All
much.
right,
Mike.
thank you guys.
Bye.